All right, well, we'll get started. Good morning, everybody, and I want to welcome you to the George S. McElwee Forum for Excellence in Public Service. For those of you unfamiliar, the George McElwee Forum for Excellence in Public Service exists to cultivate an understanding of public service in the world that is really dominated by politics. The forum is proud to host lectures and events like this one, conversations that emphasize the nature of public service and its important role in our politics and our government today. The forum is named for Northampton Community College alumnus George McElwee, who's been named as one of the college's 50 most outstanding alumni. McElwee served as Chief of Staff to former Congressman Charlie Dent from the 15th District of Pennsylvania and was the longest-serving president of the Bipartisan Chiefs of Staff Association in Washington, D.C. He is the founder and partner of Commonwealth Strategic Partners, who currently represents the state of Pennsylvania in our nation's capital and also serves as Lieutenant Commander in the United States Naval Reserves. Our forum today is of press and politics, evaluating the relationship between government and its fourth estate. The media is often referred to as the fourth estate or the fourth branch of government. Yet the media is a wide-reaching term whose bounds seemingly continue to expand. And it's no secret that, at times, the relationship between our press and politics is a little bit tenuous. And while the Constitution lays out the roles and responsibilities of each branch of government in its first 3 articles, the press has no such roles enumerated in the Constitution. Rather, the press finds itself mentioned in a single yet powerful statement in the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So how can we, the people, as stated in our Constitution, preserve our republic and hold our leaders accountable if we don't also have access to an unabridged and free press? Conversely, what is the role that the press holds with respect to both the government that it reports on and the people that it reports to? These are the questions we're going to dive into today, and I'm so excited to introduce an all-star panel that's with us this morning from both sides of the press and politics aisle. So I'm going to do this in alphabetical order as to not slight anyone. Brittany Crampsie serves as the Senior Communications Advisor for the Pennsylvania Senate Democrats and is Press Secretary to Senate Minority Leader Jay Costa. She had previously served as the Manager of Communications and Engagement for the firm Shelley Lyons Public Affairs and Communications, as well as a Communications Associate for Triad Strategies. She has been a political analyst on ABC 27 in Harrisburg and is the former Managing Editor of Politics PA. Crampsie has been named to the Central Pennsylvania Business Journal's 40 Under 40 list, Politics PA's 30 Under 30 list, and City and State PA's 40 Under 40 list. She's an alumna of Lehigh University here in the Lehigh Valley and holds degrees in politics and policy, political science, mass communications, and philosophy. Next, we have Laura Olson, who serves as the senior Washington reporter for State's Newsroom. She previously served as the D.C. correspondent for the Allentown Morning Call, the Sacramento bureau reporter for the Orange County Register, the Harrisburg bureau chief for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a staff writer for Associated Press, and a political writer for CapitalWire.com. Her reporting for the State's Newsroom contributes to papers throughout 19 states across the nation, and she is an alumna of the journalism school at Northwestern University, where she completed her degrees in journalism and political science. Dennis Owens is a 12-time Emmy Award-winning anchor and journalist for ABC 27 News. That number has probably gone up by now, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In addition to anchoring the evening news, Owens reports on Pennsylvania politics and specifically covers the state legislature. He is a sought-after debate moderator in Pennsylvania. Has moderated the 2014 gubernatorial debate between former Governor Tom Corbett and current Governor Tom Wolf, and most recently the 2020 congressional debate between Congressman Scott Perry and Pennsylvania Auditor General Eugene D. Pasquale. He has won, like I said, countless Emmy Awards, as well as the Edward R. Murrow Award for his reporting on the influence lobbyists have had in the Pennsylvania state capitol. He is an alumnus of LaSalle University and holds his degree in communications. And last but certainly not least is Amanda St. Hilaire, who is a 4-time Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter. Again, that number's probably gone up by now. for Fox 6 News in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she serves as the co-host of the Open Record podcast. She previously served as an investigative journalist for ABC 27 News in Harrisburg and as a reporter for Fox 36 in Toledo, Ohio. In addition to her Emmy Awards, St. Hilaire has also won honors from the Associated Press and the Truth and Finances Award from the Pennsylvania Institute of Certified Public Accountants. She's an alumna of the Journalism School of Syracuse University and holds her degrees in broadcast and digital journalism and international relations. So, everybody, welcome to the forum, and thank you so much for being with us this morning. And we're going to begin by asking each to, if you would, from your experience, and we have people in broadcast news, investigative journalists, print, people on the political side of the aisle. We're just going to begin by asking each of you to briefly talk about, in your experiences, what the relationship between the press and our politics has been, where it is now, and where do you hope it's going to be? And so we'll just go in order of my screen. Amanda, we'll start with you.
Hello, thank you for having me. I think the relationship between politics and the press, it goes back and forth and has a natural tension in it for good reason. You know, the saying goes, the role of journalism is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And you do have many people in politics who are quite comfortable. So there's this back and forth that happens where, as a journalist, someone who works in politics might be giving me a pretty good news tip one week, and it pans out and it becomes a story, and that person's an important source. And then the next week I'm chasing down that same person because they won't return my calls about something else that they may not want to talk about. And to me, that's a healthy relationship. One thing I've been thinking about a lot and I'm concerned about, it's a problem to which there isn't an immediate solution, and that's with the pandemic. With a lot of public meetings happening virtually, you don't have the same in-person opportunities. And for good reason. There are crucial safety measures that are happening that I, as a reporter, appreciate. But it's become a lot harder to chase down someone who won't answer your calls and hold them accountable for these questions that you have that come straight from taxpayers. It's becoming harder to have that face-to-face interaction, which can be really important when it comes to your reporting. There's a lot I can do from my living room, but there are limitations to that. And as local governments, as people in the political spectrum look at what the future looks like beyond the pandemic, I know I've heard from a lot of local governments who say they want to keep their virtual public meetings around and they want to keep some of those measures. And so that's something I've been thinking a lot about as a journalist, about how that changes the relationship between politics and the press.
Thank you, man. And then we'll go to Laura next.
Thanks. I'll try and build on what Amanda had to say there. I think when we think about the relationship, it's not only the press and public officials, but it's also the public. It's this kind of three-way relationship here. Because when I'm chasing down a lawmaker or trying to reach them on the phone, they're not responding to me because I'm Laura Olson, member of the public. They're responding to me because I'm serving as a conduit. I'm serving as a representative of the public to be able to ask questions that most people aren't going to be able to ask because we need to have like narrower channels so we can have thousands of people coming to every single meeting. We're there to represent their interests and to try to present them with information that's useful to help them understand what's going on in their government. So I think there's a couple of things that play in that relationship among each of those sides. I mean, there's a sense of tension, but there's also a sense of trust and good faith that's required to make those relationships work. You have to have a level of trust that these public officials are going to give you a level of honesty that they're able to provide. And then the public has a trust in us that we aren't trying to present one side or the other. And so I think when we think about the public or the press and public officials, also the press isn't just this monolith. We talk a lot about the mainstream media as kind of this one big entity. But in my background as like a state government reporter, as a federal policy reporter, I've generally been what we describe as a regional reporter. I'm focused on a specific state, a specific set of lawmakers. And I think that's been a great role in terms of being able to focus not only our coverage, but to build the relationships and to build that level of trust and good faith to be able to provide our readers and our listeners with the information they need, because you can understand the nuances, you can understand and have a sense of familiarity. And so I think those are some of the dynamics that we can get into a little bit further.
Fantastic. Dennis, we'll have you go next.
Well, again, thank you for having me on this. It's interesting. And you have an all-star cast here. I'm not sure what the hell I'm doing on it, but you got some really talented people. I also love a quote by George Orwell. He says, journalism is revealing something that someone doesn't want revealed. Everything else is public relations. So I love that quote, and it is kind of a guiding star. But in addition to the pandemic that Amanda talked about, is something that won't pass anytime soon. The pandemic may, but partisanship will not. And partisanship among the people we're talking to is deep, and it is bitter, and it's a problem. So if I report that there was a house fire at 321 Chestnut Street, or there was a car accident on Main Street, nobody questions that, right? We get that right, usually. But nobody has it. They don't immediately jump to, what was his motivation for telling me that there was a fire or a car accident? But if we try to go into the realm of politics, all of a sudden, to their battle stations, everybody immediately wants to question what you're reporting. And to Amanda's point, one week you may be doing something where the Democrats love what you reported and the Republicans didn't. And the next week it flips because you're just trying to find whatever the truth is. Mm-hmm. And whatever you see the truth as being, and we're all trying to distill the truth. The problem is in this partisan world that we're living in, and I think it was fueled in large part by our television brethren, the Sean Hannitys of the world, and I only bring him up because he's probably the largest name. But so many people out there, and I think this is something we need to talk about, touching on what Laura was talking about, and that is the people we're talking to. They have a role and a responsibility in all this, and they got to understand what they're watching, what they're reading. And again, on the front page of the New York Times, they don't question when they say there's a 12-alarm fire or whatever. That's not questioned. But the minute there's a story that involves politics, people immediately question it, and which is fine. That is their right. But they need to understand the difference between a column in the New York Times or a news story. They need to understand the difference between Sean Hannity and Bret Baier. And too often, in my opinion, they don't. And that has fueled this partisan world we're living in. People think Sean Hannity is Walter Cronkite. And I apologize to Walter Cronkite for including Sean Hannity and Walter Cronkite in the same sentence. But to the viewer, they often come across the same thing. And Sean Hannity, to his credit, says, I'm no journalist. Don't call me a journalist. And if you watch MSNBC, CNN, Fox News after 7 o'clock at night, you have to know that's not necessarily news. That's entertainment. They're trying to make money, and they're trying to sow seeds of discord in whatever way they want to sow seeds of discord. So all that's a long preamble to stumble Amanda and Laura and I into trying to find truth and to report what we're seeing in a political realm. And people are looking at it through the eyes of what they may have seen on the Fox News or MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, or whoever. And they're different beasts, and people don't often enough recognize that they're completely different things that they're watching. But it muddies the water and makes our job a little more difficult. Would you guys agree with that? Am I speaking out of turn here? So anyway, that's a thought. But I do think the discussion, I would love the discussion to somehow get into what the responsibility of the viewer and the reader is, because they have a responsibility in all of this as well, in my opinion.
Thank you, Dennis. And then certainly, last but not least, Brittany.
Well, as you said in my brief bio there, I was briefly a reporter, but never on the caliber of these three. So I'm not even going to pretend to have insights into journalism that they do. But now I'm in the unique position of doing that dreaded PR and writing those evil talking points that people bemoan all of the time. And we in the Senate just had an election, of course. We've got new members, and I've spent this week training our new communications directors. And I've been thinking a lot about the recommendations that I give them for interacting with the press. And it's changed a lot, even in the amount of time that I've been doing it. So when I was in school and we were studying mass communications, we learned a lot about gatekeeping, that reporters and editors were the only gatekeepers, the only way that you were going to get your message as an elected official or a politician or a wannabe politician to the public is through these people. But now we have so many other opportunities to get our message out. We have social media, for better or for worse. We have interactive websites. We have virtual forums, things where we don't necessarily need somebody to filter our message or sometimes call us on the things that aren't entirely true. Not that me or my caucus ever does that, but we're not getting the fact checking as much as we were before. And I would love to hear more on all of their thoughts on what the responsibility of the reader is and sort of sorting that out. But with the power of social media, there is a changing relationship. So the things that I post on social media are not the things that I'm sending out in a press release to reporters like this, because I know the response is going to be a little bit different. In fact, Dennis once told me that I was like 0 for 4 on setting my members up for anything controversial, and I've kept that streak intact. My role with the senators, and I work for Senator Costa, the leader of the Dems, and the rest of the other 20 of our members. And I consider my role to be promoting the good things that they do and defending them from the not so great things that they may have done or the mistakes that they may have made. Like I said, we try to avoid controversy and we try to work with these gatekeepers, but we also have other options. And I think that that's an added responsibility on our part, especially as social media platforms now start to do a little bit more fact checking, that we have a responsibility to be honest and fair and forthcoming and transparent, particularly in this very strange setting now. We also have to work with the traditional gatekeepers. They're still there, they're still very important, and there are a lot of great ones like these three.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brittany. So I want to open up here with this general question to start and really piggybacking on everything that all of you just said. When we think about news, and what I love about this group here is they come from different perspectives, right? Dennis is an anchor. He covers the state capitol. Laura is a print journalist who's in our nation's capital. Amanda is an investigative reporter. And then Brittany is somebody who's on the other side of this, who's trying to put out the releases, get media attention on certain stories, or try to manage something, a crisis per se. I always refer to Brittany as a real life Olivia Pope. And so from all your different perspectives, I'm curious about when we talk about something that's newsworthy, what constitutes something as newsworthy? In the sense that, like, what for you, what constitutes something that's worth an investigative report, or something that's on the evening news for you, Dennis, or Laura, for an article? What constitutes something that says, yes, this is something that should get coverage? And I ask that in the sense that, to what Brittany said earlier, with the expansion of media and so many different sources now, we are seeing more and more clickbait, especially via social media. And so one example, I saw The Hill, which is a very respectable DC publication. The Hill recently ran an article that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that the new Twitter function fleets gave her anxiety. Now, this was a very tongue-in-cheek tweet about why do we have fleets. Everybody was asked for an edit button on Twitter, and they gave us Snapchat instead. And this became breaking news for The Hill. And so I'm curious, for all of you, what constitutes something that in your world that is something worth pursuing? And then Brittany, on the other side of this, how do you craft something that you know or you think will get that coverage? And Mia, why don't we start with you? We'll do the same order.
Yeah, Dennis and I were actually just talking about this a few days ago because I was struggling with a tip I got for a story, and as it was fleshing out, I wasn't sure that it would rise to the level of an investigative report. In the world of investigative reporting, what I'm doing isn't necessarily just pursuing the bad actors or the people who did something wrong. Part of what I do is take a complicated issue that needs more digging, that needs more evidence, that needs an explanation that television news can service, and really taking that deep dive. I've been doing a lot about Wisconsin's unemployment system and the difficulties that people are having in accessing their payments. It's not that there's necessarily a villain in any of those stories, but it's an important issue that's affecting a lot of people, and it's really tough to understand. I think when we're evaluating the newsworthiness of something, it's who does this impact? How does it impact them? And is the way we're shaping this reflective of what actually happened? You know, if I go and I cover a protest and people are speaking and one person says one outrageous thing and everyone else, you know, was calm and on message, do I lead with that person acting outrageously and risk making it seem like the entire protest was this way, especially when you're dealing with images and with sound? And in my case, with investigative reporting, even small things like whether you put music at a certain spot, you have a lot of power in terms of how people feel when they watch your work. So to me, the biggest thing with evaluating newsworthiness a lot of times is the impact and is the general understanding of the issue.
Laura, you want to go ahead?
I love this question because each of us are going to have a slightly different answer, and that is so reflective of the way that journalism has different entry points for people and different missions depending on who our audience is. And so as a regional reporter, as someone focused on a specific state and in different roles, different outlets in that role, my first, question is going to be who is my audience and what do they need to know? Is this a story that impacts Pennsylvanians, especially when I was working at the Morning Call? Is this impact people in the Lehigh Valley in particular? And what do they need to know about? Have they heard about it yet? Is it new to them? I mean, the first part of newsworthy is new. So, that's always the underlying premise, because we don't want to tell people things they already know. We want to tell them the latest on something. If you have something is continuing in your lead, then your lead is wrong and your story is probably wrong. But also, is it unusual? Is there something kind of different to it, which is like new? But if this is a bill that is introduced every single year and does not garner any support and is being introduced for the 6th time, that's less likely to get some news coverage than a bill that has cross-party support or suddenly has new sponsors coming onto it and suggests that something different will happen with it this time, and that maybe this bill would get through a chamber to the president or the governor's desk and make a difference in somebody's life. Conversely, sometimes if things are not happening, that is also newsworthy, that, we have to write about what people aren't doing. If there's an issue that people are trying not to do things on that could make people's lives better, then we're trying to figure out how to help on that too. So, one of the big examples when I'm thinking about this is, the gun control bills that get introduced year after year, but only have Democratic support. But the ones that really would get our attention was when Senator Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin, two members from different sides of the aisle, suddenly were like, hey, we've got a proposal that's new, that's different. And it signals that something might change in the outcome of this storyline that we have seen before. So we can get more into it, but I guess that's probably a good point to start for now.
Dennis.
Newsflash, nothing changed on the gun thing, by the way, even though Pat Toomey was involved in it. It is a great question. And I want to, Brittany, mea culpa, by the way. Some lawmaker said to me, and it's maybe a knock on us, and Laura, something first to think about. They said, 80%, 90% of the things that passed in Harrisburg last year did so bipartisanly, and nobody said a word about any of it. All you guys ever talk about, and ladies, is when there's contention and the things that don't. And there might be a valid point in there. Maybe we need to do a better job of the positive story. But I remember a conversation I had with a young Amanda St. Hilaire when she worked at ABC 27. She's still young, but she was younger then. And I said, somebody driving 70 in a 65 is breaking the law. Nobody cares. It's not a story. Nobody cares. But you have broken a law. You can do a story that, hey, this guy drove 70 in a 65. But because most of us do that, who cares? But if they're driving 90, they're drunk, and they're an elected official, now that goes to a different level, takes us to a different place. What's the impact What is the interest? And I think in talking with Amanda a lot and the stuff we used to do, is public money being used, and is it being used in ways people would maybe not appreciate? Following the money was right in Watergate, and it's still right today. I mean, it's public money, and too often and frequently, people at the Capitol and lawmakers think they don't have to act as if it's public money, or if the public doesn't have a right to know how they're spending their money, which of course the public does have that right to know. So those are the kinds of things we try to go after. Impact, following the money, where's the money, and why should we care? Why should the average person care? If the average person doesn't care, then maybe it's something we let that go.
Brittany.
So my role is a little bit different. I don't get to decide what ends up on these platforms, but when we're writing a press release or planning an event, it's almost like writing a story. And I don't mean just a story in like a news article. I mean, you have your good guys, you have the bad guys, you have the context and background. And then I also like to think about the notions that everyone is coming to this story with. Like, what do you already know about gun violence in America? What recently happened? Like, what is coloring the way that people are thinking about and talking about this issue? So maybe it is something like we've introduced a bill for the 6th time and it's not getting any coverage, but this time, or it's not getting any attention or bipartisan support. But this time, it's not that we've introduced it, it's that it's been 6 years and anyone else has signed on to it, hasn't gotten a committee hearing. And they touch on that too, like what's not happening is also a story. And my role changes, I would imagine, whether you're in the majority or the minority of a party. I have not yet had the pleasure of being in the majority, but coming soon, I always hope that a lot of what I'm pitching and what my members are talking about is what's not happening, that our bills aren't getting passed. I think there were about 400 bills introduced in the Senate it's 400 that passed. We actually move a lot of legislation. 2 of them had Democratic sponsors. So we talk about what's not happening a lot. When you're in the majority and you have the power, your story changes. You like to be the good guy, you're making things happen. Whereas my stories are often about the bad guys. Sort of to Dennis's point, I think that more often than not, the media and the public treat government officials and employees like they're always the enemy. There are very few people that are hated more than people that are that salaries are taxpayer funded. So that's something that I feel like we're constantly battling against, Dennis and I particularly. So that's problematic. That's something that we deal with. I understand the concern, but it's again falling back on the same story. Like the bad guy is the taxpayer funded worker.
Brittany, to that point, I've had the privilege of serving while I was working in the Congress, both in the majority and in the minority. I gotta tell you that I kind of enjoyed the minority role because you could always cast the other side as the bad guy. And then once you step in the majority, it's like your party has different factions and they don't agree and we can't get something done. And everyone's like, you have a majority, what are you doing? So
yes, punching up is far easier from a communications standpoint. When I started this current role about 3 years ago, the spokesperson for the House Republicans, who have been in the majority since basically the dawn of time, told me that the best position to be in is as a legislative spokesperson with a governor of the opposite party, because then it doesn't really matter what's happening in the chamber. You just punch the governor. Everyone knows who the governor is. They're less likely to know the members of the House. But you're exactly right.
And also feel free, please, feel free to riff off each other and, you don't have to wait for me here. This is a conversation. So I have to appreciate the easy role I have today as opposed to poor Chris Wallace in the first presidential debate. But please feel free to riff off of each other and just kind of a talk in a conversation with each other. I want to piggyback of what was just said from all of you about how we cover things. And one of the themes that kept coming up was the idea that it has to be new, or it has to be, or something that's not being done, or something that is being done that's new, that has a different angle to it in order for this to be newsworthy. So one of the conversation points that I hear a lot is that the press doesn't necessarily have a bent to the right or to the left, but a bent to the dramatic. And we can get into bias a little bit later, but a lot of my contacts in the press with candidates that I represent will say, yeah, things need to be dramatic enough for us to cover it, and kind of what Brittany was saying, in turn for me with my clients, I suddenly am trying to now draft stories that are dramatic enough to go and sell to a Laura Olson or to a Dennis Owens. Is there a sense here, and Dennis, you brought this up, is there a sense here where the something that, like you were saying, the things that pass with bipartisan support should get more oxygen in this conversation? I think the Supreme Court has more 9-0 decisions than 5-4. But we know all the 5-4 decisions. I'm not sure most of us can name the 9-0 decisions, right? Except for, of course, the most recent election one out of Pennsylvania. But is there a sense, and I'll start here with you, Dennis, is there a sense in which the mundane perhaps deserves more news coverage? And what would that look like?
Well, the answer is yes. But I'm a political geek. Okay, so I like that stuff, and so the answer is yes. The question is, do the broader viewers care? And that's another discussion in talking about the responsibility of the viewers. Viewers can talk about how they want to. People talk about, oh, you want this grandiose coverage, and it's called PBS, and nobody watches it. So I mean, there's that product out there, and I don't mean to. I watch it, just for the record. But the point is, we do have viewers, and you do have to attract viewers, and you have to provide them stories that you think do have some interest among them, or will make an impact. So we are looking for that. Now, there is a place for what you're talking about, and I haven't figured out exactly where it is. We do cover some of it. I do cover things that are positive stories, and this bill passed, that bill passed. Here's what this guy's pushing. Here's what we cover policy things in that regard. In my opinion, it doesn't get covered enough. And in my opinion, there is a tendency, but perhaps the tendency is because that's what our viewers and readers want, to go more towards the controversy and go more towards, hey, boy, this is interesting that Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin, Republican and Democrat, are actually working together on a bill. And that's positive, but that's what makes it interesting, as opposed to here's another attempt at some form of gun control.
And I mean, I think I come at this from a unique perspective as an investigative reporter, because I'm not turning a story every day. So a lot of reporters are turning at least one, often multiple stories every day. We have shrinking newsrooms. So when you have scarce resources and you're allocating who's going to cover what, you don't always have the person who says, you know what, I'm going to give extra context to this unemployment situation and take a deep dive into the history of all these bills that passed and got us to where we are today, right? That's something that, even though it's not new, it's new context for a current thing happening. That kind of coverage is important, but it's becoming increasingly rare because we do have shrinking newsrooms and fewer journalists. We also, because we're in an industry that you don't get into to get rich, we're having an increasingly younger and less experienced group of reporters. And fresh eyes and fresh perspectives are great, but when you lose some of that experience that can bring context or take down the drama level in favor of more depth and more understanding, that does have an effect on your overall news coverage. I think the best antidote to this, quite frankly, and the best antidote to bias in general, but specifically to this issue of being attracted to the drama, is healthy, robust newsrooms that are also diverse newsrooms. People who come from a variety of backgrounds, people who have different skin colors, have had different life experiences, who can fill in each other's blind spots and help go after the nuance more than pursuing the next shiny object.
And I would build off what they both said in terms of the finite amount of time and resources, not only from the reporter side, though Amanda is correct that newsrooms in general, I mean, when I started in the Harrisburg State Capitol newsroom, there weren't any empty seats. And now when I've gone back to visit the Capitol in Harrisburg, often the lights are off in sections of the press room newsroom, and it's awful. I mean, in pre-pandemic times, but I mean, we have fewer eyes looking at what's going on. But also from the reader or listener's perspective, I think about my mom, who is not a political junkie, and often about what she needs to know about something that's going on. She's not interested in spending all day reading about the latest political drama in the same way that I or other people on this panel may be. So what does she need to know about what's moving forward? How is it going to affect her life? And, how do we frame it so that it is useful to her, so she doesn't just turn the page, turn the channel, and go find something else that is more interesting? How can we make these very important issues interesting, relevant, and accessible to people?
So if I can just piggyback off that, so one thing that has changed too is the younger people dynamic. So, people want social media, they want the 240 characters, they want to know the story in that, and that changes the dynamic of what we do as well. Social media has certainly changed what we do. News is no longer at 5 and 6 when we do our newscasts. It's all, the news cycle is 24/7, and the audience now expects to get that information on their devices or wherever, whenever it happens. So also, boiling down a headline. Yesterday, are we speaking to mostly Pennsylvanians here? Is Pennsylvania, is this right?
Mostly. A few from out of state, but mostly Pennsylvanians.
Well, so yesterday outside Harrisburg, there was a 5-hour meeting by the PIAA on what to do with winter sports as we're dealing with the pandemic. It was 5 hours. And the one reporter who was on it just was, as she says, lost in the sauce. Like she had all this sound, all this stuff. And I said, tell me what actually happened. She said, well, here's what actually happened. The PIAA, which governs sports in Pennsylvania, they're the governing body of sports. The PIAA says they're not going to step in and shut anything down. They're going to leave it up to the individual school districts. Boom, there's your story. I know it took you 5 hours to sit through a hearing and all that, but there's your headline. That's what her grandmother or mother needs to know. They're not going to weigh in and shut things down. It's going to be up to the individual school districts. Boom, there's your story. But sometimes that's very difficult to get to, but it's also helpful in that, sometimes the Twitter, if your Twitter brain, tell it in 240 characters. What's the story? And that's something we now have to think about, the social media concept or aspect of it.
And I'll jump at it. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
In the newsworthy sense, that also makes kind of a change in what's newsworthy day to day. Because if you had to sit through a 5-hour hearing, then maybe you don't have time to take a look at that bipartisan bill and what may come out of it and the policy changes. And on another day, the bill that passed with bipartisan support there may be time to take a look at it and what that's going to mean and what sort of policy changes and how that's going to affect people's lives. So on a day-to-day basis, what is newsworthy changes based on what's going on.
There's an excellent book by Neil Postman called Entertaining Ourselves to Death. It came out pre-social media, but it's a little bit about what Dennis talked about in his introduction, that all of these commentary shows are sort of skewing what the news is. There's a nugget of news in there, but it's almost entirely commentary. And you would be hard-pressed to find anyone that says that that's less entertaining than listening to the hard news. And when we're filling 24/7 news cycles, you don't have that much news, particularly in Harrisburg, where we have like 30 session days a year. I think everything that we do is really interesting, but most people don't, and it's not enough to fill 24 hours of coverage. So it's hard to argue that commentary and opinion pieces are less entertaining, or if you had your choice between the two, you're going to pick the one with the person that agrees with you and is also riled up about the same things that you are. And I don't really know if anyone is to blame for that. It's just a change in consumer tastes. But, and I will try to not be partisan in this, which is very difficult for me in my role. But one thing that gives me hope about this is the election of Joe Biden. I think that people were drawn to the drama and the scandal and everything of Trump. We had 4 years of it. And now I think to some degree, people are tired of scandal. They're tired of drama. They want the vanilla ice cream of politicians. And that's basically what Joe Biden is. You're not going to have the headlines that we had in the last 4 years. And 81 million people decided that they liked that better. So I find some hope in that. And I'm not going to get into the politics and policy of it, but I think just on the style of news and attention that our candidates are getting, I think maybe we might be worn out or getting close to worn out on the high drama entertainment value.
I found it interesting that last night Sean Hannity tweeted that Joe Biden mispronounced the name of one of the cabinet secretaries that he was appointing. And I didn't because I don't want the wrath that comes with it, but I was tempted to tweet back, if that passes for drama in the Joe Biden presidency, as opposed to what's been going on for the last 4.5 years, sign me up.
I think a lot of people feel the same way. I mean, there's still those that are going to be interested in the drama and things, but maybe we get that in other sources. Maybe we don't go to our news and our politics looking for it anymore. And maybe it's a very optimistic, hopeful look at it, but we have tons of other options to get entertained and angry and dramatizations of whatever we're interested in besides our politics.
And I think one of our challenges and responsibilities as journalists is to take the things that might seem more boring, but are important for people to understand and have an impact on people, and make them interesting without sensationalizing them. And that can be a really fine line. But I say this as someone who does a lot of reporting on public records and transparency issues. And I'm doing these stories, basically trying to show people this isn't a speeding ticket. This is something that affects your day-to-day life, especially with local government. Your local government affects your day-to-day life oftentimes far more than who's president. And yet that gets the least amount of attention because it sounds boring. And a lot of those meetings are 5 hours. And so when you're trying to present that, you want to do it in a way that's interesting and engaging and drives the point home without sensationalizing it. And that's, I think, the challenge that we have as journalists.
And sadly, I want everybody to take a look at Amanda St. Hilaire, because you're looking at a unicorn, because she gets to do investigative reports. She doesn't have to turn a story every day. And when she does a 5-minute television story, they actually let her put it on the air. You could probably name on one hand the number of TV stations in America that are doing that right now. Fortunately, she works for one, and she is one of the best reporters I've ever seen at doing it. But that, unfortunately, in our industry, and getting back to Laura's point about the economics of it, that is a real problem that is impacting the quality of the journalism in our country today.
I want to second.
Thank you. I think it's whether you have the limit in terms of what you can write from the print side and how much you can include, or whether it's just the time you have. I mean, in TV news, if you get 2 minutes to explain an issue, that's an eternity, and it doesn't leave a lot of time for nuance. So I do think that the more in-depth dives, and I think we underestimate how much people actually like that. I mean, look at the most watched television program in America is 60 Minutes, and there's a reason for that. And that often is not super flashy in its presentation either. I mean, they'll air a 7-minute interview that's just TV shots cut back and forth, Q&A, and it's insightful journalism. So some of it too might be there is a tendency to misjudge what will land with readers and with viewers.
I want to second what Dennis just said there. Amanda's been gracious enough to join my show, Face the Issues, a few times. My mother watches the show religiously, which is kind of scary. And she texts me and says, Amanda St. Hilaire is my favorite person on TV. And I'm like, aren't you watching my show? She's like, yeah, you're number 2 now. So there's that. But to that point, I think, it's what we try to do, week in, week out, as Amanda will tell you, is have this law-informed conversations. And I think to all of your points, it's difficult sometimes to engage or get the public or your viewers to engage in that conversation. I'm also thinking of, how do I do that? What's the carrot I put out there to get them engaged in a long-form conversation, a more in-depth discussion? Brittany, I want to start this question here with you. I mean, one of the things, this conversation leads to one of the things that all of us deal with in our fields, which is talking points. And we put them out. I'll tell you, when I was working in the U.S. Senate, we had a large staff meeting between our DC and our stateside staff. And someone on the stateside staff said, when you send your talking points, you got to realize that nobody stateside cares what committee this bill's in. They want to know, what does it do? Is it good or is it bad? And that's the only thing we care about. We will market it from there. And it was a bit of a wake-up call on both sides of saying, how do we craft talking points that we then send to Dennis and Laura and Amanda and try to sell this idea? And on the other side, for our journalists, what do you do when you get talking points? Like, what's the kind of the process with that? And so, Brittany, why don't we start with you on this one? What's your mindset as you're drafting your talking points?
So, in a little bit of defense of talking points, because I think that people criticize them as just, being glib or skimming the details. I'm a reasonably intelligent person. I have a master's degree in public policy. I can sort of read legislation. I can figure out most of the interesting things that are in there. But bills can be up to 1,000 pages, and they're in very archaic language that you don't speak in, and they're not really accessible for the public. So you can download any bill that you want. You can read the whole thing yourself. I'd recommend other hobbies, but that is available to you. It's just not accessible. Bills as they're written are not meant to be digested by the public. So I like to think of talking points more as the framing and the summary. So you need to know the points that are going to get the public to understand what the bill does. And sometimes those are only like 2 or 3 bullets. It's like a 5-hour PIAA hearing, and all you need to know is they're not doing anything except not requiring masks for swimmers. But I also like to bring in a little bit of context, a little bit of framing. So it's not just this is what the bill does, it's why we're introducing this, why it matters, what the impact will be. And then I also like to have a nugget in there of how much it's going to cost, because that is always the follow-up question. Now, I use talking points more so to prep my staff and the senators themselves so they're able to converse about it. I would never send them to a reporter and ask them to cover the issue that way, but they do certainly inform a lot of the press releases that I'm sending out, or the way that we're posting about a bill on social media, just so we're all on the same page and talking about it the same way, which I think can, come through in the coverage perhaps, but I don't send them to reporters. I don't think they want my talking points. In fact, I can only imagine the response I would get from them if I sent them my talking points and asked them to cover a story exactly the way that I asked. But I think of them as just a preparation document and a digestible piece to give to the public so they understand what their government is doing. Because I think it's almost arrogant to give a whole piece of legislation to the public and ask them to figure it out themselves. Like, my role is sort of as a representative between the institution of the Senate and the reporters and the public. I'm not going to hand you a bill and ask you to figure it out. I'm going to tell you what it means, what it costs, why we're doing it. And that's what talking points are for me.
Any of our journalists, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a journalist, I expect when I interview political leaders, I expect them to have talking points. I don't feel any animosity about that, because that's just part of how the process works. My job is to sometimes get past the talking points, especially if you're talking to someone who, drafted the legislation, or if you're talking to someone who should have some kind of expertise on a particular issue, or if you're talking to someone who's running for office. One of the things I remember, Dennis was moderating a debate. I think it was the Republican primary for governor. And one thing he did that I thought was really smart was he went around to the different reporters in the newsroom ahead of time, because we're all covering different issues. He's like, what questions do you have? And everyone had different priorities. I had been covering a lot about nursing home issues in Pennsylvania. That's not something that a lot of politicians get talking points on. Dennis asked that question during the debate. The responses were insightful because you were getting kind of the raw, unfiltered answers. You could see in real time the candidates working through that issues, and some of their knowledge or lack of knowledge about the issue could come through, and voters could decide how good they are with that. So there's no, I don't know of any reporters who are angry that talking points exist. And when you're talking to the run and gun reporter who's has an hour to collect all the information for the story, and you're trying to sort through it, knowing each side's talking points helps you. But your job then is to go beyond those talking points and say, okay, what's missing here?
Yeah, I'd agree with what Amanda said. I think talking points or press releases are a jumping off point. They are a messaging device. They're telling us what is important and hopefully why, and the general contents of whatever the bill is or the policy that we're bringing up for discussion. But then our job is to add context to it, or to add, to find out why people are leaving out other pieces of information. What isn't included in there that people need to know to be able to understand this and to be able to evaluate whether it's a good or a bad or a neither idea at this point? And why is that information not being put forward? Would it make the bill less likely to succeed if people were talking about the things that are left out, or was it just not part of the discussion at this point? So, you have to evaluate all of those factors and bring it together. And the Talking Points in the press release is just one piece of the tools that we are using to do our job. And if you don't use the other tools, then we aren't doing our job.
Yeah, and I respect the talking points, because then at least I know where they're coming from. Now, there's two sides to everything. We're going to go get the other side too, but at least it tells us where she is. Brittany, I would beseech you to go work for the courts, because during the last election, there were, I'm not kidding, 300 motions, and all the courts does is send the motion out, which, as arcane as legislation is, you ought to see the legalese in these filings that can be 100 pages long, with no description of what the hell is going on, and what is happening. And I don't have a legal degree. I'm not a lawyer and won't play one on TV. But there was no explanation whatsoever as to, hey, here's what's going on here. They're suing this for that, and they're claiming this. There were no talking points whatsoever. Now, they argue it's legal stuff. They don't want to get involved in that, because if they try to interpret it, it may be interpreted wrong. And whenever you have a whole room full of lawyers, it's never a good thing. So
it's funny you mentioned that. My predecessor in this role is actually the consultant for the courts now.
I'm well aware.
No. I have noticed that as well. They post the docket number, which is not helpful. I know that reporters don't always believe this, but I think part of my role is to be as helpful as possible to provide information. I have access to a lot as a staffer for the institution the reporters don't necessarily have. And it is not typically my position to just encourage that they submit a right to know request. I like to give as much as I can upfront as possible. And I guess that's not the approach of every government institution, but I don't think, I've not found yet anyway, in my case, that more information hurts the case that I'm trying to make. That if we've come to the decision to introduce a piece of legislation or advocate for something, we have a reason for that, and we have an obligation as taxpayer-funded employees to provide that justification. We're not trying to, be shady or pass things in the middle of the night anymore. That was like 20 years ago in the Senate. I think giving the public the information that they have paid to create is certainly a best practice for someone that's working in PR.
I want to shift the conversation to something that Dennis and Brittany have both brought up, and is also some of the questions coming in on our chat here. So if you do have a question, please submit it via chat. I'll see those. We won't be able to get to all of them today, but I'll get to as many as we can. And so I want to begin this shift in the conversation actually going to Amanda and talking about her favorite topic in the entire world, open records. Amanda is the co-host of Open Record Podcast. Brittany just brought this up, so we'll start with Amanda, and then Brittany, I want you to chime in as well. The question in the chat is directly for Brittany. It says, you mentioned earlier in the session that part of your job is to talk up the good things and defend the mistakes that have been made. And so the question is, where does the role of ethics come in that profession? And I think there's a sense here as well with on the open record side of journalists making these right to know requests, asking for a certain access or asking for a certain transparency. And yet on the political side, I mean, we have to navigate that in various ways. So, man, I'm going to ask you first if you could kind of cover what open records is and what the process is. This is something that you do all the time. And then, Brittany, if you could kind of talk about how it is on our end, on the political end, how do we navigate that, trying to keep with that level of accountability, but also we have a job to do defending our clients and our members. So we'll start with Amanda.
How much time you got? Brittany, if you have any sway, right now the state legislature is exempt from turning over many public records, and that would be a great thing that could change in Pennsylvania. So public records are records that belong to you. They belong to the public, and they show you how your government is acting. And sometimes they can be things like receipts for tax dollars that were spent, expense reports. A lot of times government emails fall into that category, communications. There are even voicemails in Wisconsin, at least. in Wisconsin, investigative reports about government agencies are considered public records. In Pennsylvania, they are not. So every state kind of has their own different rules about what the public can access, what the public can see. And so part of my job is requesting records. And sometimes it comes from a tip. Often it's just, hey, I wonder what's here, or I wonder what this says, or I'm interested in learning more about this issue. And the beautiful thing about public records is it's right there in black and white on paper. So it's a lot harder for someone to misrepresent what happened or what they said, because you have the documentation of it. And they can be used, public records can be used for a variety of things. It's how we've discovered patterns of sexual harassment in school districts. It's how we've uncovered food spending at the municipal level. Things about how your tax dollars are being used, but also sometimes the lack of access to public records becomes a story, because again, these are records that you pay for and that people you pay are supposed to maintain. And so when you can't get the records, then oftentimes that becomes an issue too. The nice thing about the public records is they can be the thing that can help you get past the talking points or find out who was really influencing a decision. When that happens, I mean, when I get public records from an office, their office knows they've turned over those records. So they're usually ready for me to call and ask questions about them. Usually it goes better for them if they answer those questions than if they don't, because if you allow these public records to just stand alone, sometimes that can be not so great of a look. Sometimes there is more context that goes into it, and you want to be in a position to explain that, and my job is to find that. So that's a huge part of my reporting, both the records themselves, but also letting people know when they don't have access to these documents.
So the majority of my role is like the chief cheerleader for the Senate Democrats, and it's a role that I like very much. I have the blessing of believing in everything that my members are doing. I like them all as people. I like the work that they're doing. I fall ideologically along the same spectrum that they are. As far as the ethics question goes, I think that is top down. I don't think there's a singular answer for everyone that does communications or public relations. Again, I am very lucky to work for very ethical individuals that believe in being open and transparent. I'll give a very specific example. 2 years ago, we had a member of the Senate Democratic Caucus that was accused of sexual assault and harassment of staff members and campaign staff and women outside of the political spectrum entirely. I was never put in a position to defend that member or attack the victims or cast aspersions on the people investigating it. We were forthcoming in producing a report, an investigation. We shared that, and we cut the member basically out of our caucus. They weren't able to use caucus resources anymore. They weren't able to rely on caucus communications. They were removed from our caucus meetings. But that's a leadership decision. It's not that your PR professional gets to decide that, although you do ultimately decide whether you're going to stay working for this organization. So people see, again, I'm really trying not to be partisan here, but there's a lot of blame assigned to the press secretaries of President Trump, that they've lied or they've obscured some facts, I guess, if we're being generous, and your leadership puts you in that position. You're not deciding to lie on their behalf. You're deciding to keep the job, and there's responsibility there, but it's top down. If anyone is looking for a PR job, I would really consider the ethics of the organization and the individuals you're going to be working for, because you do have a lot of power and there's a lot of leeway in how you're going to talk about an issue and how you're going to work with reporters. But the ethics really come top down from your organization.
And what I appreciate as a journalist is when I get that honesty from someone who works in public relations when we are covering something that may not be so flattering. I've had people who work in PR go, off the record, yeah, this is bad. This was not good. And, they're not going to go on the record and say that, but even that acknowledgement, it's something that helps build that trust between those relationships. And I know that sometimes if you're working in public relations, And Brittany, you and I have gone back and forth on interviews that maybe your boss didn't want to do. And I know that's not your decision. You are the facilitator of communicating that information. But also people who are in that position can prepare their boss for what's going to happen next. So I did a story back when I was in Pennsylvania about how the state legislature handles sexual harassment complaints, and different rules in the House, or different rules in the Assembly, different rules in the Senate. And, it was something that at first leadership on both sides of the aisle didn't really want to talk about. After they had declined interviews, my job is to show up at press releases, show up at budget day on the Capitol, chase people down. And for the most part, the people who worked in PR prepared them and said, hey, you're on the spot now, you got to answer those questions. And the people who stood there and answered our questions came across looking a lot better than the people who literally ran away.
I want to go to, same idea, same theme here, but something that Dennis had brought up at the very, very start with that. In open records, Amanda, you said it, it's really for the public, right? This is not just something that journalists do for fun. This is not a hobby. It might be a hobby for Amanda, but for most, it's not just a hobby that we go and file FOIA requests. This is for the public. This is for all of you to be informed. And Dennis, you brought up at the very, very start the idea that media is for the public, and it's at the end of the day is really dictated by public engagement. One of the questions that has come from our audience says, what kind of revolutions are social media and new reporting styles going to encounter that may conflict with the information that's provided to the public by people like you? What are the pros and cons of this? And I kind of want to direct this in the sense of, with all the new media, it is changing public engagement. And does that impact how we report, and how do we deal with that from a journalist perspective, from an investigative reporting perspective, from a political PR perspective?
So thanks for coming to the old guy on the panel for the social media question, which I still struggle with. I don't even know what half of them are anymore. But the one thing I'll go back to, needing the viewers and consumers of this news and information need to know where they're getting it from. And during the election especially, there are things on your feed all day long or after the election. Oh, there's a truck full of ballots in Pennsylvania that were fake, and the fake news crowd. And you really look. In the old days, the news, as I said, was at 6 o'clock. David Brinkley famously said, "The news is what I say it is." And for many of you on the panel, David Brinkley was an ABC News anchor. The news is what I say it is, and he was right. That is, people got their news from Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley at 6 o'clock, and what they said they could reasonably trust was accurate. Well, now people can get their news instantaneously when they want it, 24/7. But you have to be you have to pay attention to where it's coming from. So when ABC 27 reports something, and I'm not saying we never make mistakes, we do, everybody makes mistakes, but we stand behind them and there's a place to go to question it. A lot of times, and by the way, we could get sued if we do it recklessly. That's not true of all the things on all the different social media platforms. Having said that, the social media platform is amazing. I mean, I'm thinking of that spring of discontent in parts of the world where, people are literally overturning governments via Twitter and letting the rest of the world know what is going on. I mean, the impact is unbelievable, potential is unbelievable, and the ability to communicate with people and viewers and listeners and because I tweet my stories out now too. After I do a story, it goes on the web and I tweet it out as well. So I'm reaching a whole new group of people that couldn't be sitting in front of their televisions at 6:04 when that story aired. And just look at our current president as far as Twitter is concerned, in what he has been able to do and Brittany talked about it. They don't need the media necessarily. They're going to go right to the people. They can do that with these social media platforms. And I think that's actually a good thing. There are just some pitfalls that people need to be aware of as they watch it. And I should note, and Brittany, I think I'm right on this, Governor Wolf, who is nobody's example of hip, actually tweeted the fact that he has coronavirus yesterday. That news came via Twitter, which I laughed about because I'm thinking, is he following President Trump's That would be the only thing he and Trump would have in common, of course. But I just found that amusing that the governor was tweeting his own diagnosis of coronavirus, and he put that news out there via tweet.
I'll jump in here. I think one interesting thing that we have to grapple with is the responsibility of these social media companies. And until we have a situation where these social media companies have more responsibility for the content, like Dennis said, it's up to those who are using those platforms to vet and understand what they're looking at and differentiate between something that is coming from a trusted tenured media outlet versus somebody who just saw something and wanted to put it out there. And I don't think as a society that we have really focused as much, both as journalists, as a country in general, on the media literacy and social media literacy necessary to understand what is out there and what you're really seeing. But we have seen some discussions at the federal level of what the responsibility of those social media companies should be. We've seen frustrations from both sides of the political aisle about this, because we've seen some conservatives who feel that some of these platforms perhaps are maybe silencing some of the voices of conservatives. And we've seen Democrats who are upset because they aren't silencing people who are spreading misinformation intentionally. So there has actually been some discussion in some of the congressional hearings about how to deal with this when these social media companies are not held responsible for the content in the same way that a New York Times or a television station is responsible for the content that they're putting forward. But until there's any sort of like movement on how to even tackle that sort of task, it's up to the viewers and the people who are using these platforms to try and sort it out.
And the problem is the allure of information that confirms what you already believe is strong. And I mean, if you look at the way the brain works, our brains literally filter out information that challenges our worldview. You are less likely to, even assuming you believe the information, you are less likely to remember it. It is less likely to stick. I think some of it can come down to people using common sense. Going back to our earlier conversation about drama, we talk about how there's a gravitation toward drama. If there's this crazy election scandal, we're going to want to cover it. We're going to be out there wanting to report that and give you that information. That's the kind of story that journalists live for. So if you're not seeing that being reported by major news outlets, is it more likely that we all got on the phone that morning and engaged in our own conspiracy to cover it up? Or is it more likely that we would take that and run with it if we had the evidence for it, and then give you that very dramatic information? So if something sounds too good to be true, or it sounds outrageous, and you're not seeing it reported anywhere else, that's where you need to really start to question it. Because the second something that is outrageous and can be proven comes out, you see everyone jumping on that information and trying to confirm it for themselves.
I've read that if you're on Twitter in a single day, in like a short number of hours, you are exposed to more thoughts and ideas and opinions than somebody at another time had in their entire life. That is an incredible amount of information. And I think that we can excuse people a little bit for not researching every single thing that they see. I think that you need to be an educated consumer of information, but just the raw quantity can be so overwhelming. And with social media being a self-selecting place, you're probably following things that you already agree with or already believe in. So you're less likely to double check. And then if you're seeing them in the volume of that, and you can find pretty much anything that confirms anything that you believe on the internet, which is another horrifying thing. But one thing that I try to do with Senator Costa's social media, I don't ever lie on it, obviously, should go without saying, but when people are posting things that are not true, I try to respond and I try to provide citations for things that we've posted. I was doing that a lot yesterday. We posted about taking precautions against COVID-19, wash your hands, wear a mask, that hospitals are converting other wings into COVID units. Now we're running out of space in a lot of hospitals, particularly smaller ones. And I had maybe 5 or 10 people respond and say that that's not true. And I talked to a nurse and they said that that's not happening in the hospital that they've been in. So I spent a good amount of time pulling the data that's available from the site, from local news coverage that talked to doctors and county commissioners and hospital administrators, and I posted that. And I don't know if you change a lot of minds on social media, but there are some people in the middle that are still interested in information and didn't just come there to attack Senator Costa or share their own anti-masking point of view. But on another note, I want to talk about how powerful social media is and how it can give a voice to people that are traditionally excluded from the political process. Somebody like AOC, she gets tons and tons of press coverage, but she's just starting her second term. I guarantee that most people can't name 10 other freshman or sophomore members of the House of Representatives. She has no real legislative power. She doesn't chair a powerful committee. She doesn't have tenure. She doesn't have a huge staff budget. Her power comes from social media and the attention that she has built for herself there, which I think is really interesting, and it really threatens a lot of the traditional power structures. So if you're in an institution where seniority means a whole lot and your members' average age is like 70 years old, which I think is what it is in the US Senate, if you're a young person with a strong following and a strong audience that you've built on social media, you're going to be able to wield that in the court of public opinion in a way that you would not be able to as a freshman member. And if that power is used for good, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There are many examples of people using it for evil, but I like to think, like Dennis was talking about the Arab Spring, like that was social media giving a voice to people that are traditionally voiceless. And I think that that's really inspiring in the political process. It really shakes up, this is the way that things are always done, or like this is exactly the way the system has to be run in perpetuity. It really doesn't have to be anymore, with that change in gatekeeping roles and ways to create power for yourself that actually don't require very much money.
And it also expands the reach of information. A few months ago, I did a story in Wisconsin. Judges were holding all their hearings like through a YouTube stream, but then they were deleting those videos off of YouTube. They were worried that essentially, and we got emails that said this, they were worried people would use the videos to mock them. And so the question is, are you deleting these public records? If people get locked out of the live stream, they then haven't been able to access this court hearing and no one knows what happened, and our courts are supposed to be open. And that story, if it had just aired in a newscast, you're limited to whoever happens to be sitting in front of their TV. I did a Twitter thread on it, and it's probably the story I've posted on social media that spread the most. And it is not the most dramatic story. It's not the most sensational story, but something about it hit a few groups of people, and it went everywhere. And so that's when you have that kind of reach and you can use it to spread factual information and information that has evidence, you can use that to your advantage too. So I think as journalists, we're not only trying to figure out how do we combat misinformation without actually spreading the misinformation, because sometimes when you fact check something, you end up amplifying the thing that was wrong in the first place, and that's a challenge. But we can use it to spread evidence-based reporting.
And along those lines, one of the other questions here is about, as journalists, as PR people, how do we check our own passions if the story is something we're very passionate about, right? I mean, the federal government, we've often been told, if this is something that is too, like if you're doing casework, it's something that's too close to you, or it's such a high level that, and it's something that personally, maybe hand to someone who's not as attached, because that clouds our judgment. The question is, how do we guard against our own passions and biases? I mean, all of us have at some point probably been accused of spreading misinformation, or of giving a platform for misinformation, or being biased and members of the mainstream media, and trying to take down the republic, et cetera, et cetera. Where's that divide for us personally in our biases, but also where's that divide, what Amanda just said about when we try to correct misinformation, are we spreading it? How do you deal with that tension?
Can I just answer this one first, since I was most briefly a journalist? This is one of the major reasons that I left journalism. I couldn't keep my passions to myself. I found that my passion wasn't necessarily finding both sides of the story. It was advocating for my side. So this is not something that everybody can do. It's not something that even most people can do. So I know that reporters get beat up a lot and think that they're advancing their own interests, but as someone who tried to do it, that is absolutely not the case. And I look forward to their answers.
I mean, I think it comes back to what I said earlier about filling in your blind spots. So part of it comes from knowing where those blind spots are. As someone, I know that I am very likely to be sympathetic to someone's story of sexual assault or sexual harassment. So because of that, that doesn't mean I don't report on those issues. I do. But it means that I'm going to go to my colleagues and check that and say, here's what I have. Am I off base here? How is this worded? Dennis and I have read countless scripts for each other and made suggestions, or what about this? Or did you think about that? And I think when you have a lot of people from different perspectives in your newsroom who can serve that, it can help you, but it requires you to know where your own blind spots are. There's also, you have sources in this industry and you're friendly with those sources, and you need to make sure that you're not too friendly with those sources to the point where you wouldn't report on something bad that they did. I mean, there was a public official who personally I liked very much, had to do a story that he wasn't thrilled with. He tried to kill the story. He was not pleased that I did not kill the story, and never spoke to me again. And I was okay with that. Because that's just something you risk with doing your job. You need to be the kind of person who, if your mom was accused of committed a crime, you'd tell your newsroom, well, obviously I can't do it, but I guess we got to run the story. And I think that does take constant vigilance and monitoring and a certain level of self-awareness.
Weird analogy alert, and I've got a ton of them. I referee. My son is a 6th grade flag football player, and I'm a referee in those games. And twice this year, he had what was most likely a touchdown, though it was close, and Dad did not give him the touchdown because I didn't want anybody thinking, oh, you gave it to him because it was your son. So I erred the other way. So recognizing, as Amanda said, where your blind spot is and making sure you're going above and beyond to get that other side in there, or massage it the other direction, or making sure that side is heard. Fairness is a big thing to me. The one thing I want to be called when I'm all said and done, regardless of anything of stories I did, I want people to say he was fair. And I do get that, and I'm proud of that. And I think if you're fair, it overcomes the potential biases you're talking about. The best story I ever did, the one that you mentioned that I won a Marrow for, the person who was the target of it was not target, but the person who was, the target. It's a lobbyist, a powerful lobbyist in Harrisburg. 2 days before the story aired, I called him on the phone and read him every single word of the story to see what his reaction was. He said, I have no reaction. And basically it pointed out how powerful this lobbying firm was in getting favors in state government. And Cynic said if he was smart, he would take that story and put it on his website to show other people how powerful he is in Harrisburg at getting things that he wants. But the point is, fairness is the key, and that's the one thing I can guarantee, that I'm going to be fair with my stories.
I would circle back to what Brittany said at the beginning of I've always felt that if I had an issue that I felt so strongly about that I needed to advocate for it, then I would go do that. I could probably make more money doing it in a cynical point of view. And it would be a lot easier. If there's something you're that passionate about, then your work is just, it doesn't feel like work. You're talking about the things that matter to you. And I think those of us who have been reporters for a long, long time have been more interested in going for that issue of fairness and trying to find the truth and advocate for the public. And that's always been kind of a driving force. We're human, so we're not going to get it right all of the time. But it's looking for kind of what is going on and trying to explain it to the people that always drives me. And when you're looking at traditional newsrooms, there's someone, as several of my colleagues here said, looking over your shoulder, it's not just you. There's someone else who's backreading you. There's a check against any sort of potential bias you might have. And there are other steps that we can take. I mean, most journalists aren't going to give money to causes. You try to avoid any sort of appearance of impropriety so that you can take a step back. And if there is an issue where you felt that you couldn't, then you would need to, bring that up with your editor. So when you're talking about a traditional newsroom and not some sort of, less reputable news source, there's likely a conflict of interest sort of, policy within the newsroom to try and check against anything like that. So we do what we can. We're human, so we're not going to get it right all the time, but if we're still doing it, it's because we want to go for fairness, and that's all we can do.
And I think Laura brings up a great point that often perception is reality. So even if we know that we can report fairly on an issue, sometimes we still do remove ourselves from it. I have a close family member who works in healthcare and was widely known in our community in Pennsylvania. I felt like I could pretty fairly report on health insurance issues, but I didn't. And I stayed far away from that because we have the same last name. It just wasn't going to be a good look, and it would open up anything I wrote, no matter how great of a story, no matter how fair of a story, it would immediately, the content of the story people weren't going to pay attention to because they'd be distracted by the appearance of bias, even if I felt as though I could still report on it fairly.
I think I remember there's the late great Tim Russert, who passed over 12 years ago now, if you can believe it. Tells a story about how he came into the newsroom once and someone was showing photos. They were part of the Women's March or some pro-choice rally, and they had gone and they were just showing photos. This was something they did personally, and Russert said, how many of you went to the March for Life, which is a pro-life march this same weekend, and nobody had gone. And he said, how many of you know someone who went to the March for Life? And nobody had knew anyone. And he said, how many of you in your circles of friends know someone who's pro-life? And no one in his newsroom raised their hand. And he said, this is the perception, to Amanda's point, of bias. He said, how are we going to cover a side of an issue when we don't know anyone who stands on that side? And it's not to say that we change our views, but if all politics is local, as former Speaker Tip O'Neill said, then it becomes imperative that we know people that we can go to and at least avoid the perception of bias, which I think all of you just hit on. And if I could add, Brittany, I got to work with Brittany when she was at Politics PA, and I was doing campaign management. And Brittany, for what it's worth, I thought you were remarkably good at your job. And I thought you were very, very fair and remarkably good at what you did. I represented the Republic at the time. Brittany obviously is a Democrat, but I thought we never got a bad shake. I thought you were more than fair. So don't sell yourself short, my friend.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Obviously, our time is running out, if you can believe it. And so I want to close by asking, and we'll go back in the same order we started with, but asking each of you one final question. What advice would you give for members of the public with how they consume political news? Amanda, we'll start with you.
I think it's making sure that you know who you're getting your news from and that you are consciously seeking out a variety of sources and a variety of platforms and mediums, because what you see represented in a newspaper is going to be different than how it's presented on television or on social media. I do think, and at the risk of saying consume less journalism, I think that sometimes you need to give yourself a break from consuming all of that content, whether it's political or not, but also because your perspective can be a little more fresh once you come back and you've taken that break. But I think if you find journalists whose work you like and you trust, and that's another beauty of social media, is you can build that relationship a little more with listeners and with viewers and with readers, and you follow those people, then I think that's a good start. And just question everything that you're reading. If you're reading something and it's really confirming what you already thought, question that. I think just being self-aware enough to know what is my own bias as a consumer going into this can help you become an intelligent news consumer.
Laura?
Lots of good points from Amanda. I'd agree with most of those. I would actually, I think, encourage you to stay away from social media. I don't find it to be a great place to read political journalism. I find it a great place to do sourcing, to track issues. But I think if you are someone who is not committing time to weed through all of the things that are out there, then I find it to be a confusing and chaotic way to consume political journalism. I would recommend that people go directly to your source, whether it's a TV station, a newspaper, an online outlet, hopefully multiple, as Amanda said, read widely, read a lot, as much as you can, but from a range of perspectives, and keep an open mind, because I think that's important. You need to go into it not assuming that the people you disagree with have ill will or are seeking to destroy their opponents. We have all these like conflicting words that we use in political journalism, but keeping an open mind and a certain amount of faith that people may someday work together and may want to actually get some things done, I think is helpful and could help kind of lower the level of the temperature of some of the discussions that we have when it comes to things like that.
There's a new feature on Twitter that I love, and if you look at the headline and you want to retweet it, and a little box pops up and says, "You sure you want to retweet that because you haven't read it yet?" And I think that's not bad advice for all of us and all of it. So in other words, make sure we know what we're reading, make sure we know what's in there before we allow it to get in here, and do a little digging. Is this the only person reporting this? Does this sound outlandish? Does it sound too good to be true? Then probably it is. And look to verify it elsewhere. And again, as the two ladies just said, the trusted sources are the trusted sources for a reason. I don't mean to be an establishment guy, but there's a reason. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or all the places where you traditionally go to get Politico and the various places, make sure they're saying it too, is my only point. But we do need to be wary, W-A-R-Y, of all of this information all the time. It's a great thing, but there are also downsides to it, and we just need to be aware of that.
I would advise everyone to expand their social media following beyond the things that they actually like. So you're on Facebook, you see a page for a politician that you would have voted for, you hit like, but maybe think about following and liking politicians that you don't agree with, or commentators that you don't always agree with, just to see what people are saying. But I would also advise against falling into the absolutism of two sides. I mean, there may be two people saying different things about an issue, but it doesn't mean that they're both valid and they're both right. If I say the sky is up and someone says it's down, just because people have opposing opinions doesn't mean that those two are valid. And we don't necessarily need to seek out opposition to the truth or opposition for opposition's sake, but just being better informed, and what everybody said already. I have nothing more to add beyond that. Oh, but if you do want to follow all of the straight news and facts about what's happening in Harrisburg, you can follow Senator Costa at Senator Costa.
I love the plug. Well, thank you, everyone. And I did put the Twitter handles for our panel today in the chat. And so welcome you to go and follow each of them. And again, I want to say thank you, Amanda, Laura, Dennis, and Brittany, for joining us, for your time. I know this is a crazy time of year, and so appreciate them taking their time. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. One of the things that I say ad nauseum to my students is that information should lead to knowledge to understanding, and ultimately understanding to wisdom. And that begins with the work that all of them do. And so just wanted to say thank you to all of you. And that draws this forum to a close. And we want to wish all of you a very happy holidays and a very blessed new year. And cheers to 2020 finally ending. So again, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.